Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 413, side A, November the 2nd, 1979. Those were a few lines from Evita, the folk opera, which is on Broadway right now, which you know I like very much. I'm going to do one half of the tape this week on Chappaquiddick instead of the entire tape because we get too backlogged with the news. So maybe for the next 2 or 3 weeks or 2 weeks, I'll do one half because I've been promising some people the Chappaquiddick story, and then on side 2 of this tape, we'll update some of the most important stories of the news that we can. As far as the books on Chappaquiddick, I have given you, I'm typing a list here for you of the books which you can get from research that are available on the Chappaquiddick story, the details of what the witnesses said or didn't say, or the details of the car, the location it was in, and the discrepancies in the official version. There's so many of them that, and many of you have read the books, that you can get any one of these books and get a pretty good idea of some of the details of Chappaquiddick. Last week, this past week, on the floor of the Congress, a lawmaker got up, Representative Robert K. Dornan, and he gave a speech about Senator Ted Kennedy on the floor of Congress. He said that only one member of the Congress of the United States has ever swum across the Chappaquiddick Channel, and that it was him and not Ted Kennedy, and that he had gone up there the week after the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne, and he had swam across. Ted Kennedy said he did, and this gentleman said that he didn't, this Representative Dornan. The important thing was that he said that Senator Ted Kennedy shouldn't be running for President of the United States unless he tells the whole story. He says he gave a pathetic, lying speech about what happened at Chappaquiddick, and that the cover-up must end before any credibility to the campaign for the presidency goes on. He claims that the official story that Senator Ted Kennedy gave at the time that he was on the island of Chappaquiddick was that he took a wrong turn and went off this small bridge into the water, that he tried several times to dive into that car to rescue a woman named Mary Jo Kopechne, and he was in a daze and went back to the cottage where about a mile back where the people were that he was partying with, his friends and various women at that house, and that some friends came back with him and dove in the water and couldn't extricate Mary Jo Kopechne out, so they went back to the cabin and told everyone there not to say anything, and then Ted Kennedy was supposed to go swimming back to the mainland and come back the next morning, and somewhat in a daze, he saw them bringing a car up out of the water and recognized that it was his car. When he got back over the mainland, he made a lot of telephone calls that night, so he knew something had happened. But this is the story, all of you know, the overt story of Chappaquiddick. My own personal feeling is that if Ted Kennedy were to run against John Connally or against Jimmy, in the primaries against Jimmy Carter even, I would vote for Kennedy because he's the lesser of all the evils. I think he's terrible. I'll give you the reasons why, and we'll go into the accident some more. But if we have somebody like John Connally running for president or Ronald Reagan, I guess you have to count your losses and know that the public leaders in this country are really nothing, and just take the one that's the least bad of all of them. Jimmy Carter has Brzezinski gunning for World War III. We'll do a little more of this on the other side of the tape. I don't know what kind of appointments Ted Kennedy would make on the Supreme Court. These justices are all old and ready to die off, so this is a very important election. I know what Ronald Reagan would do. So it may be that you have to vote the lesser of evils, but I don't believe that you should have any illusions about Ted Kennedy, and don't go along with all the belief that he's going to save the country. I'll do a little more on the parallels between him and Evita Peron. Maybe that's why I like the play Evita so much. She reminds me of Ted Kennedy, and there's certain lines in there in the play that describe our political situation right now and Ted Kennedy. As far as the bringing up on the floor of the House the situation of his lying, there were several members of Congress that objected, that they claimed that a lawmaker shouldn't attack another one on the floor of the Congress, but he said that Mr. Dornan said that he believed that the full truth should be told. If a man's going to run for president and he's married and has 3 small children at home, and he's at a girly party with a bunch of married men and single women, and a woman is in his car, not somebody else's car. It'd be bad enough to be at the party, but it was his car, and is dead, and he goes home back to the hotel and has a night's sleep, or is back comfortably in that hotel and doesn't go to the police. And he's a lawyer and a senator and doesn't go immediately because they said she could have been rescued. There were air bubbles in the car and her mouth was up to the top. She could have been rescued. So he, instead of going back to the officials and saying, come help us extricate her from that car, he goes to his buddies and they make a plan of covering up his party. His reputation was more important than that woman's life. So that's what I think of Ted Kennedy as far as being on the floor of Congress and saying these things. I think he has a right to say them if they're pertinent. John Dean came out last week and said that Richard Nixon has information on his tapes that could affect the 1980 politics. At the time of Watergate, we found out that Tony Lasowitz, the head of the Dirty Tricks Department and the Blackmailing Department, who has houses where he photographed the women who are Chappaquiddick with male lovers that were really paid agents. He has been following them pretty closely. He was there that night. Who knows if he wasn't bugging the cottage that was rented before the accident took place. Nobody's ever asked him under oath what time he got there and how he got there. Allegedly, he was a newsman, but he was at the island that night of the accident, and he had been paid $100,000 by Herbert Kalmbach, the attorney for the President of the United States, who handled the dirty tricks money, in June. That was 1 month before Chappaquiddick. Tony Lasowitz was given $100,000 and was up at the island that night. Now, John Dean says Nixon could affect the 1980 politics. What I'm sure he will not do is pull out the Chappaquiddick stories until Ted Kennedy gets the nomination. He wouldn't bother with them, but will use them as a trump card. And then if he gets the nomination, the Republican would be sure to get in because of the scandals of Chappaquiddick. Never underestimate the power of Richard Nixon. This is how he stayed on top all this time. He's now bought a townhouse right next door to David Rockefeller. So even though Nelson Rockefeller is dead, David, president of Chase Manhattan and Exxon Corporation and all the Standard Oil and other franchises such as Dow Chemical, etc., Sterling Drug, with all their connections, the great David Rockefeller now has his next-door neighbor, Richard Nixon. They can have a tunnel between the house or the walls, a two-way speaker system, and they could manipulate candidates, all down the line for years because Nixon has all this information being in the White House. And Dean has said that Nixon could alter the 1980 politics if he disclosed on the tapes information about Ted Kennedy because, according to John Dean, I recall Mr. Kennedy was a fascination for Mr. Nixon, and a lot of their agents at the White House were told to find out what happened at Chappaquiddick. Well, what John Dean isn't saying is, let's see what we can do to Ted Kennedy so that he doesn't run in 72. The question is, set him up and then expose what happened. Incidentally, there's an article in the Los Angeles Times and in the Chronicle out here, and maybe in your Eastern papers this last week on Interpol, which sanitized the purposes of the Nazis and J. Edgar Hoover, and I will put that information on the tape soon. But the important thing about Adolf Hitler, when he came to power using Interpol and his secret police, was setting up women and public officials for blackmail. That was one of the important things in the Book of the Mormon, was fixing up judges, public officials, police, district attorneys. It's a direct quote from the early Book of the Mormon. We'll get any of those bastards, we'll set up these call houses and work our way up into the political spectrum through the bedroom. And Richard Nixon knew that. He worked closely with J. Edgar Hoover for years, and J. Edgar Hoover kept these files. He was vice president of Adolf Hitler's Interpol when the war was over, and the Nazis were still running it continuously with their lists of information about various people from 1946 to 1950. J. Edgar Hoover is vice president. And a lot of his muscle was in knowing about the bedroom tactics of Eisenhower over in Europe, heads of states in this country, fixing them up. He worked closely with organized crime, and the Vegas headquarters and the call girls were used, and the houses all over Europe and New York City. Look at the one that Nelson Rockefeller was at. His murder could be concealed because of his visits with Megan Marshak or Poinsettia Pierce. So that the use of women and blackmail came out at Watergate. J. Edgar Hoover was expertise at it, and it was this way. I used to say our elections were guided by bullets and blackmail, but there's really 3 B's: bullets, blackmail, and bedroom. Many of you know that when Robert Kennedy was running for president, his mother was on the peninsula, and I gave her a letter dated May 28, 1968, that's the day she was here, saying that the scope of the gun was at the back of his neck, which was where he really was killed, from behind and back by Thane Caesar. And 4 days later, Robert Kennedy was murdered, and I had explained to her why he would be killed before he ever got a chance to run for president. I got no answer from them even after he was killed, and I corresponded with Ted Kennedy July the 1st, 1969. Now, maybe it was my intelligence looking at what happened to the other Kennedy brothers, to Joe and Jack and Robert, but I had a feeling that as early as 1969 that Ted Kennedy was in imminent danger for the 72 elections, that he wanted to be president against Richard Nixon in 1972. John Kennedy had won the election against Nixon in 1960. Robert Kennedy was killed, so Nixon became president in 68, and Nixon wanted to be reelected in 72. But I don't know why I selected that date. All of a sudden, on July the 1st, I got a flash that Ted Kennedy was in imminent danger. And I wrote him a letter, and it was, "Dear Mr. Kennedy, I'm not going to write you one more letter. I promise I'll get off your back forever." But I sent a letter warning you that you were in danger, and this is the gist of the letter. I won't read the whole thing. It's 3 pages, and I have a copy here. And I remind about what happened to Robert Kennedy, and I heard that his family was sending the children out here to the tennis ranch, Gardner's Tennis Ranch in Carmel Valley, which is about 4 miles from my house. So I asked if his sister, Sergeant family, could come out here and just stop by Carmel Valley Road if they were bringing the children, and that I could tell him, and I used the word that he was in a nest of rattlesnakes. I said, "You're in a nest of rattlesnakes, you are in danger, and that your assistant, Andrew Vitale Jr., has thrown off all my letters and not paid any attention to me, but I wish that something could be done." And I put in the letter, "I'm not so worried about you as I am about ourselves and our own country, but you're in imminent danger, and you have to move swiftly to counteract what's going to come down on you." And I have this letter here, July 1st, 1969. Of course, then 20 days later, Mary Jo Kopechne was dead, and for all purposes, that ended Ted Kennedy's chances of being president in 1972. The first cartoon about it came out July 27th, a Conrad cartoon, and it shows a crane on the bridge over there at Chappaquiddick lifting up Ted Kennedy's car, and the license number is 1972, and the car is all crashed. This was remember the accident was in 1979, and the message that Conrad had in his cartoon was, "Your election chances are ended for 1972. You won't be running against Richard Nixon," which is, in fact, what happened. That was 20 days after I had written to him that they should get in touch with me, that I had done all this other work on the assassination. I have copies of phone bills here. I saved those too. I have New Bedford, Massachusetts, $4.65 phone call, August the 7th, and then another one to the Kopechne family. I had asked the Kopechnes, I got in touch with them and told them that they should insist on an autopsy. They said no autopsy. Now they're sorry. They've come out and said they're sorry. I said that the woman has been poisoned. She left the party early, according to the first accounts, and it was about 11 o'clock, and she was drowsy and was asleep in back of the car. It's hard to believe that a woman who works for Robert Kennedy or Ted Kennedy, a boiler room girl they call them, associate, is so bored at a party, a cookout like this, that she's asleep in back of the car. Then Ted Kennedy had left the house, and later he had a concussion, which appeared to be a blow to the back of the head. And the way I restructured it was that, in my own mind, there wasn't evidence at the time, but this is what I was telling the DA down there and the Kopechne family and calling them, was that Mary Jo and Ted had something in a drink that made them drowsy, and that she went to the back of the car and was asleep. He went out the house or the cottage to see where she was or what was happening, was hit on the head, and then put on the floor of a car, another car, not his, and driven across the bridge, because the ferry still went that time of night, in another person's car. And then he was delivered to his hotel room and came down. He came down around 2 in the morning, but nobody saw his face and stood around the corner and said, "What time is it?" And nobody ever saw him in wet clothes or testified under oath that he was soaking wet or had been swimming or had been submerged in water. And I figured that he could be on the floor of another car that nobody was looking for, go over the bridge back to the hotel, have the concussion and be doped up, come down, and then wake up in the morning and realize that something was wrong, calling around for help, and then come back, find the car, and found out that this Mary Jo was in his car. Meanwhile, other persons could take that car to the edge of the bridge with her in the back and set it off and drive it so it goes into the water. As a matter of fact, later, and this is in these books that I'm giving you the bibliography of, that car was seen much later than Ted Kennedy and the others said. It went in the water. The sheriff had seen it much later. He saw 2 men and a woman in that car, and there was a secretary, Rosemary Keogh, whose purse was in that car. Not Mary Jo Kopechne. Mary Jo's purse was back at the house. If she was leaving the party on the island there over at Chappaquiddick and going back to the hotel, she would have taken her purse with her. But the person, Rosemary Keogh, wouldn't be in that car. But by mistake, that purse of the other woman was in the car, and there were 2 men in the car. And then the car could be set off, and Bob Cutler has done all the work on the mechanics and the dent in the car, the way it hit the water, and the markings on the car to show that it could be triggered to go off, speed off into the water without any of the males in there, but with Mary Jo in back and with Ted Kennedy drugged and hit on the head as he walked out the house. He had told his driver, Mr. Crimmins, that he would take the keys and leave himself, but why would a man who has a chauffeur leave a chauffeur off on an island and be going back to the hotel room and leave him stranded over on the island? There were so many discrepancies, but I did call the Kopechnes. Of course, they didn't know me from Adam, and I told them my research and what I had done, and that they should look in her stomach for poisons that made her drowsy when she was asleep in back of the car, which, of course, they didn't do, and as I say now, they're sorry they didn't do. I also called New Bedford, Massachusetts, August 8th, and talked with the district attorney's office, and I said, fingerprint the car if you can. I know it was underwater, but I wonder if there's anything on there because I don't think Ted Kennedy was driving the car. Ted Kennedy said when he went back to the cottage, he asked for Mr. Markham, and I was wondering if he's sitting wet in a car and it's night and everyone's asleep back at the cottage, who was outside that he said, "Get me Markham"? If he didn't go in himself and he just says, "Get me Markham," who did he say it to? Because Markham didn't psychically wake up when Ted Kennedy was sitting outside asking for him. He walked back to the house, and they never said who he asked to get Markham. I also told them to find out who saw him in wet clothes, and also how many doors there were to the cottage, if there was a front door and a back door, if there was only one door to this cottage to get out. Then I asked the question of who served the drinks, who was responsible for the food, and that came out later at the inquest, and to check out the concussion on his head if he was hit on the back of his head, and check out how he really got to Eggertown, if there was another car, another driver, and which people were sleeping in the living room and which in the bedroom. In other words, do an autopsy on Mary Jo Kopechne and trace out which people had access to the doors to go in or out. Now, it was just prior to Ted Kennedy's accident at Chappaquiddick that I had completed reading a book called The Secret War for Europe by Louis Hagen, and it has stories of espionage, and the story of Otto John in Germany caught my eye because he was a liberal anti-Nazi who left at the time that Hitler was in power, came back in Germany to help reconstruct Germany and not put the old Nazis back. He fled to England, but he was fighting Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence, who had been working with Allen Dulles since 1942. And Otto John would have blown the Gehlen operation that was being set up in Germany again, with the Nazis all in power in the police, intelligence, and so forth. So Otto John was taken on a ride. This is an interesting story. He went to a house where he was visiting a family, and this family had been anti-Nazi and had been very political during the war, and he was honoring them. He went to see this family, and while he was there, he went to visit a doctor. The family was the brother of Bonhoeffer and other anti-Nazis, and a man was to take him to visit this family, the family of Klaus Bonhoeffer. They're well known, and the family doctor was supposed to take Otto John to visit these people, and Otto John went to the office of this doctor. The doctor said, well, wait, I have a meeting, and then I'll take you to see the family. And this was in July 15th, 1954, and he had been at West Berlin for a convention and went to see a Dr. Wohlgemuth. And he wanted to get some medical certificate for a friend and for a pension that they lost during the war. He wanted help for these people because they'd been displaced by Hitler. And he went to this doctor's office, and he got drowsy. The doctor said, wait, I have to stop for a minute, and I'll give you some coffee. And Otto John took the coffee while he was waiting for the doctor, and suddenly he got drowsy. And the last thing he remembers was that the car was going top speed, and he was being raced away. And when he woke up, he was on the Russian side he was in East Germany, not West Germany, and he was forced to talk. They told him to make a television show saying that he was a communist and that he was sympathetic to the communist regime, and that his being an anti-Nazi was because he was really a communist. So Otto John had to stay in East Germany for quite a long time, and it's an interesting story. You can read it in this book, The Secret War for Europe. He finally escaped back to West Germany. He was totally discredited. He was given 4 years of hard work in a prison for being a spy. Nobody in the government would believe him, and his friends wouldn't help him. And he obviously was part of the Galen operation. They had spies in Eastern Europe, every country of Western Europe. The Pope is one of those great spies, is Pope John Paul II. But Hitler had a network that we used of Galen's in East Germany, all in West Germany, in Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, in the Soviet Union, and he was obviously in the hands of a German spy that would discredit Otto John politically so that he couldn't expose the Nazi network. But what's so interesting about the Otto John story was that he was somewhat liberal. He was trying to make some changes. He got drowsy from some coffee. That incident caused him to be totally discredited politically, and he could no more rule against those Nazis and the rightist governments in Europe. And besides that, he had to serve time in prison. When he made his famous television speech about being sympathetic to the Nazis, the news media from all over the world were there because they were very well familiar with the Otto John family and their patriotism during the war and before, and as public servants. And one of the news people said to Otto John, or several of them, when did you decide to become a communist? And he said, when I got on the other side, when I woke up on East Germany, I decided. And nobody picked up what he was saying, and nobody came to his aid. And when Ted Kennedy gave a speech, it sounded so much like Otto John. Nobody believed it, but nobody bothered to pin it. There isn't a Democrat that has tried to show the work that the Nixon team did to defame him, because I think the trump card is that Tony Lasowitz would come out with photographs of Ted Kennedy probably having sex before the drowning. And therefore they can't do a thing, and they have to stand for the lies, and the people that are friends of Ted Kennedy's can't ask for the truth, because then he certainly could never run if he was caught in these compromising positions there or elsewhere around the world. So he's caught with all his past sex, like Robert Kennedy, with all of his escapades, and Marilyn Monroe and Jimmy Hoffa setting them up so that he never could open up his brother's murder, because his chances of political life and divorce and Catholic family, breaking up the families, they just dangle the pictures of these men. And old Joe Kennedy, the ambassador to England and the father of his 10 children, was a man who played around all of his life and had mistresses and women and set the example for his boys and wanted them to be president. But it's different running a liquor store or having property and being your own boss and having all these women than having a political career where you want to be senators and presidents of the United States. The worst way to run this country, and the way it is run, is through blackmail, so these people have to think about saving their face first and then think about us second. Penn Jones Jr. in Texas wrote in Forgive My Grief, Volume 3. He's written 4 books and has a newsletter that comes out every month. He wrote in that book about the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, and he made note that Mary Jo, the woman that died at Chappaquiddick, who was at the party with Ted Kennedy, had a roommate, Carol Tyler, and Carol Tyler was the secretary to Bobby Baker. She died in a plane crash over the Atlantic Ocean. Mysteriously, she died, and she was, the secretary to Bobby Baker and was privy to all the dirty dealings that Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Baker had. Then her roommate was this Mary Jo Kopechne, who worked with Smathers. Now, George Smathers from Florida was best man at Kennedy's wedding, and he was close to Kennedy, but he also was the man that, when he was in the Congress, took Richard Nixon down to Miami and introduced him to Bebe Rebozo. And Smathers and Rebozo and Albanap and the Nixon team have been very, very close. So Smathers' secretary, Smathers was part of those dirty teams and setting up the Democrats and the blackmailing that was going on at Watergate. That whole Miami group was thick into always making Richard Nixon president. Smathers' secretary, Mary Jo Kopechne, goes on to work for the Kennedy boys, and then finally has been found dead in a car. And Bobby Baker's secretary, who's a roommate to Smathers' secretary, Mary Jo Kopechne, his secretary is in a plane crash right after the Bobby Baker scandals and the Lyndon Johnson scandals were going. So the two women, were expendable, and the careers of Bobby Baker and are covered up. A lot of it's covered up. A lot of the dirt of Lyndon Johnson was covered up, and also through the use of this woman, the presidential goals of the Kennedys began to stop or cease, at least for the time being, and they'll be pulled out again. As soon as the car went into the water, the headlines began. New York Times, this is 1969, Kennedy's career feared imperiled. Another article, Associated Press, Senator Mansfield doubts Kennedy will run in 1972. Another one by Evans and Novak, anti-Kennedy congressmen were quick to sign his political death. Another one from the New York Times editorial, tragedy and mystery. And that, if you go back to 1969, the summer of 69, and go to your libraries, it was very clear that the political career was through. There also has been printed over and over again, I have 4 different copies of it, the 20-year presidential jinx cycle. So in case Ted Kennedy were to run, or in case John Connally takes Alexander Haig as vice president, or that old tired Reagan takes Haig, watch the vice president this year. That's going to be the important one, because it's already a fait accompli that the one who gets in is going to be killed. We have this jinx, and they go back to 1840 to Harrison, who died in office in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, 1880, James Garfield, 1900, President McKinley, 1920, Warren Harding, 1940, Franklin Roosevelt, 1960, John Kennedy, and this is the 20-year. So if Reagan takes Haig, the military would love that, and they would have General Haig, and then Brzezinski and Kissinger would have their army ready to go. Everybody talks about who's going to run for president, but really, I repeat, the vice president is the important one, because that's the one that's going to direct us into the 1984 nightmare, and I'm afraid it can be a nightmare. I think one of the reasons I like Evita Peron so much, and I keep talking about it, and there's lines in this play that Che Guevara keeps singing to Evita Peron that remind me of Ted Kennedy. He keeps saying, what a circus, what a show, that the candidate, the person in office, is just there to keep the people happy. They don't offer you anything. They just are an image. And Evita says, what do you want me to do? They don't want me to change the world. They don't want me to fight poverty. I'm there just to make them happy. I'm a superstar, like a radio entertainer. Ted Kennedy is a superstar. He's done nothing so far. He's an image, and people want images, so they're willing to settle for that. Well, before you get onto your bus, before joining the forgotten brigade, how can one person like me say, alter the time or midway the game is played? This is Mae Brussell. It's side 2 of tape 413B, November the 2nd, 1979. That voice on the tape that opened this is Juan Perón in the play Evita. And as I say, the parallels between Ted Kennedy and Evita Peron are just so overwhelming to me. The military and the ruling class disliking the Kennedy families and willing to continuously do them in. And in that particular scene, Peron is saying, on the other hand, she's all they have. She's a diamond in their dull gray life. And can you think of any time, can you recall the last time they loved anyone at all? Ted Kennedy is riding in on the coattails because I think people genuinely did love John Kennedy just for the hope of what it could become, if for nothing else. The 1,000 Days offered a promise. Richard Nixon was given his time. He made promises, and he turned out to be the crook everyone believed he was. But this country has been dominated by the Kennedy family and the bedroom antics of John and Robert. And Joe was killed in the war, and Ted, and going from women to women in bedrooms, and totally corrupt in the contradictions of their own selfishness. That's the way Evita Peron was. She would have the masses believing in her and the labor unions, and they thought she was great. She had sent the British out of Argentina, but the Nazis and Germans had always run it anyway, and she only wanted her own self-acclaim, and she sang and organized, and the people wanted her, and the masses wanted her, and she sings a song to Peron. There's only about 20 who really don't want us. The people want us. But it's the 20 that runs the country. That's the fact of life. And the illusion she had before she was poisoned, like Martha Mitchell, and she believes that the masses out there will determine, but the masses forget very quickly and easily. And the justification for her being a good leader, Peron can rationalize to his military officers, is that when's the last time that you loved anyone at all? Imagine the sleazy bunch, because we put our hopes into the Kennedys and their antics with their wives and families that they had, and the images, the PR job, and the antics of the bedrooms, that we end up with people like John Connally and Ronald Reagan and General Haig and Howard Baker, who covered up the Watergate story, or Mr. Bush, who was the head of the CIA and also our ambassador to China. And now we'll go on to the legacy he left to China, too. The president of China is now asking that East and West Germany be united. He's asking Germany to put in atomic weapons. He wants again a war against the Soviet Union. The whole time that George Bush was ambassador to China, he was getting ready for their promotion of their pro-German relationships and their anti-Russian to make war against the Soviet Union, which all the major countries want to do by 1985. That goes into another murder this week that went off with class, and that was the South Korean President Park Chung-hee. It's getting better now. They didn't use a North Korean and say it was a communist and then have to have a cover story that was so elaborate, another Lee Harvey Oswald. The system now is finally throwing over the nice guy image, that they have to bring in the troops because the communists are coming down. We will work with the murderers, with the new government, the new administration, which I'm sure we put in. Somoza was an embarrassment in Nicaragua. The Shah was an embarrassment in Iran. We now have to get Marcos out in the Philippines. But the beautiful thing about this murder was that it was just up front with public officials, and they didn't have to bother with the subterfuge any more than when Hitler went into Poland or Yugoslavia or Romania or Belgium or France. It was all set, and he just went in, and he didn't have to have an excuse that the communists did it. His excuse for the Reichstag, for rounding up the radicals and the students, was the Reichstag. But after that, when he was in 1933, Adolf Hitler didn't need excuses. There was deep political unrest in Korea prior to this murder, and in order to understand that, I'm going to share a few articles with you preceding the murder, because that's the clue to what went on. The rest is just a cleanup job. One from the New York Times, October the 16th, 1979. Japan's economical influence is everywhere in South Korea. Now, if you take a triangle of the Trilateral Commission with Washington, D.C. in one area, and the Netherlands and West Germany, Prince Bernhard and the Gestapo, the West German connections, and Japan, at that angle, they're going to swallow up Europe and the weapon missile systems and arm for this war in Russia against the Soviet Union. And Japan used to control South Korea, and in 1945 their influence was over. Right now they're back, as the New York Times article says, Japan's economic influence is everywhere in South Korea. Now they've come in, according to the New York Times article, since 1960s with their investments, which is just the tip of the iceberg. The rest is loans, credits, share exchange, technical agreements, trade missions, and so forth. The Japanese virtually control the Korean economy as much as the Americans dominate the defense side. Our country goes totally bankrupt, sending armies, and when this murder took place over there, our army goes in. We pay the taxes for the soldiers, the generals, the airplanes, the ships, the helicopters, and the businessmen reap the profits, and Japan has all the loans and credit. So actually, since 1960, they own Korea economically, and therefore they own South Korea, and they will eventually then merge with North Korea in a war against the Soviet Union. That will be their trump card later. But Japan, according to an article the week before the murder of President Park Chung-hee, says that Japan's influence was everywhere, that they literally own, and that's the tip of the iceberg, South Korea. Another important article prior to the death of Park Chung-hee was the disappearance, October the 18th, of Kim Hung-wok, a very important man. He was writing a book to expose the Korean CIA, the new government that's now in, the one that murdered the president, and he worked with our House Senate Committee investigating Koreagate. He lived in Alpine, New Jersey, and he went away 2 weeks before this murder in Korea, 3 weeks before, and he went to Paris, and he disappeared. He usually has a bodyguard, and he had defected to this country. He was the chief. He served as chief of the Korean CIA from 1963 to 1969, and he defected, and he wanted to tell the story about what was going on over there. He had received death threats, and he was told his life was in danger. He also took out of the country $10 million with him. And the Korean and the U.S. sources were afraid that he had been kidnapped because he was working with not only with the KCIA, but he knew the functions of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI and their connections to the Korean CIA. Now, that is a man that should never go without a bodyguard. I think you would agree. But he has obviously been killed, and they had to kill him before the junta took over. We won't see him again. He's disappeared like Jimmy Hoffa. He's dropped out of sight in Paris, 54 years old. He testified before the congressional committees. He helped arrange funds for Tongsun Park, who's still in business entertaining congressmen in Washington right now. And he was writing a book on how President Park came to power and retained power and how Seoul operates today. As I say, he was once head of the KCIA and left there, and nobody knows why he didn't have a bodyguard. The Korean government had asked him to stop publishing his book. He had resisted the pressure, so you know that they've deep-sixed that man, and obviously they had to do it and maybe take his manuscripts before these new murderers got into power. The next article, New York Times, October 21st, leading up to this murder, the week before, Brown, that's the head of our Defense Department, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, was in Japan and Korea. This is New York Times. Brown observes Japanese defense forces. Japan's Air Force and Army displayed their skill and firepower for Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, who was in Japan and Korea on a 4-day visit. He encouraged the Japanese to increase their military power. Japanese specialists on defense have said their nation is more receptive to steady but unobtrusive expansion of their military strength. In addition, Mr. Brown's visit, he underscored the American backing of Japan's protest to the Soviet Union on a small island near Japan and urged in Seoul, Korea, and in Tokyo. He emphasized the American Naval and Air Force would move quickly to help you, but wanted Japan to increase their defense. If Japan owns Korea, South Korea economically, and is encouraged by our Defense Department to step up their weapons in both countries, you know what that means. Another article, Friday, October the 19th, Washington Post. Seoul, Korea, to get more U.S. arms. Mr. Brown steers South Korea's internal problems. And it goes on, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown stepped up military, artillery, helicopter aircraft forces in South Korea for their first domestic production of fixed-wing military aircraft. He was there to help them build up the aircraft. Brown met today with President Park, and according to U.S. officials, he had a letter from President Carter, and Carter had removed the ambassador because of the human rights problem, and Carter was now secretly approving of weapons to be built up in South Korea their armed forces, and Brown was over there steering them to increase the armaments. We promised that we would pledge armaments to South Korea. Forget the human rights story on the front. The ambassador may be home, but that doesn't mean a thing. We're increasing the armaments in South Korea. Of course, the arms are used to keep the people down and not to stop the North Koreans. One of the important things is arming against revolution inside the country. Another article, October the 20th, Los Angeles Times, South Korea students riot. Now, the problem with the President Park Chung Hee was that the students were demonstrating and there was unrest, and the universities were closing and there was curfew because of his expelling a candidate that he was running with. He promised when he came in power in 1972 he'd have elections in 1979. But by murdering him, you can put off any elections for another 7 years. Another article, the New York Times, Sunday, October 21st, that was the Sunday before he was murdered, seeds of South Korean protest were sown by their new prosperity. And it goes on to say that the younger people in South Korea were getting educated with money coming in, and the martial law and street riots that were taking place that last week before he was killed were brought on by an industrial revolution in Korea. South Korea is not a rich country, according to the New York Times article. The average Korean earns $1,500 a year. That's what he earns. What's that, $100 a month? A little more than $100 a month. But new power centers have sprung up, and there's new power unions, and the government and the Korean CIA has to keep these people down because the big business community owes everything to Mr. Park. There is a gap, according to the New York Times article, of the poor. The gap is larger between the poor and the rich. This is the quotation. The gap from rich to poor has surely grown. It is visible. There's chauffeur black sedans. The inflation has gone up 30%. Mr. Park is afraid of the trade unions he serves. The tycoons serve the Korean multinationals, and they don't want the trade unions to overthrow their profits. It's loud and clear. The family, Mr. Park came from a poor family, again, similar to Evita Peron. He's not aristocracy. He's a poor man. They thought that a poor man would help them. Evita kept saying as she came to power, I'm one of you. I've been poor, so you understand how it is, and I understand how it is. And then in the middle of her career, she says, can you blame me? I can't change matters anyway. That's the way the government is. That's the fact of life. I was a prisoner in my own poverty. I had to get out and have some fun. That's why that play, I'll keep referring to it over and over on the tapes, because we're reliving these Evitas all over the world that are happening. See, and Park came from a poor family, and they thought, well, being poor, he would understand the poor. But they put in the multinationals and kept the labor and the students down, and the profit. And of course, this always happens in times of revolution. The seeds of South Korean protests were sown by the new prosperity. When you see the very rich with their Cadillacs and their jet sets and their money and their parties, and the average worker is making $100 a month, he's not going to be poor very long. He's going to be very hungry and angry. And when the young students get educated and riot, then you close the students, bring in the police with the arms trained by the United States Army, the police forces all over the world, and the CIA, and you bring in the soldiers, and you knock down the students like Hitler did, and you round them up, and you lock up your opponents, and you cancel elections. Just before his murder, another article, Sewell orders the army to maintain order in 2 more cities. A riot at the town of Masan in Korea. Military control is set in the industrial complex near Pusan. More universities are closed. This is like Nazi Germany. This is why they had to have an excuse. Mr. Park wanted the excuse that he was moving away from the Middle Ages and the Inquisition, and he was going into his modernized society. But the industrial multinational society is for those 20 people that Peron is singing about in Argentina. 20 run the country, not the masses. And there were riots. The universities were closed. They shut down the universities and had martial law, and this preceded the murder of Park, an excuse for the army to come in totally. Another article, just before his death, Park retains firm control in South Korea. Now, he can't maintain firm control if you have martial law the year you're supposed to have an election, if you kick out of your Congress or Assembly your opponent, if 68 of your top leaders equivalent to the Congress there walk out because you've imprisoned and removed somebody who was going to run against you. This was a former presidential candidate. Kim Dae-jung was a candidate, and he was under house arrest, and the government shut off all visits of newspapers to see him. They're getting ready for an election there when he arrested his opponent, and then sympathizers in the administration, 69 members of Kim's party, walk out. He can't keep the image any longer, and the total dictatorship is there. Another article in the New York Times, reporter's notebook, toll from Korea, rioting shrouded. And they don't tell you how many students and demonstrators were locked up, how much firing of the military reached the people, who was arrested, who fled the city. There was censorship in the city by the Korean CIA and the news media. An article in the New York Times, the news media covers, the Korean CIA covers, blankets the country of 37 million people, and they're not getting information out. And as I say, the opponent of the president was arrested, and people from his administration walked out, 69 people. Another article that was written a day ahead, but before Mr. Park was killed, was ominously familiar student unrest. Now, why wouldn't the students whose parents are earning that $100 a month, and they have lots of children, they're slaves, they're using now the radio, the cassette machine, the organizing. They're seeing themselves similar to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and they know there's no future for them except slavery. And the student unrest preceded this murder, but of course the murder of the president was simply to get rid of him and let the Korean CIA and the military take over. They couldn't handle it. There was a program on ABC, I believe that was the TV station this week, on the baby makers, on the test tube babies of the future, and comparison to Adolf Hitler's Liebersborn. And the subject came up, are you purposely looking for babies with high IQs and mentality? And the answer on the program from the doctor, no, we want hard physical laborers. We don't want any lazy people in the future. It reminded me of Alternative 3. We want hard laborers. I'm going to try and send for the transcript of that tape because that is about verbatim what they said, and I was writing it down. So the point is that the student unrest are not the laborers. Those are the high IQs. They're going to college. And remember the Bible, the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit was knowledge. And it goes way back. The suppression of students goes back to biblical days. You can have some fun, and it wasn't even sex or anything else that was bad. But once you have knowledge, you can overthrow the power structure. So whoever wrote the Bible was saying, don't learn too much, because then we won't be the historians of the future. And the point is that the student unrest that was taking place was going on continuously. The country, since 1972, had drawn up a constitution. They were ready for another election, and the universities were closed. So therefore, it was time to get rid of this man, Mr. Park Chung Hee, murder him, and put the hands in the military, and then you can take care of the students very nicely and take care of the opponents, because the country is in quotes chaos. And then the excuse, bring in the American troops because the North may come down and tamper. Now, John Kennedy was killed November 22nd, 1963. November 24th, 1963, according to the Pentagon Papers released by Daniel Ellsberg, the war to Vietnam escalated full scale. The war against North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese hadn't removed one shoe and put it south of the border. There wasn't a shoelace or an incidence of them doing anything in those days of mourning for Kennedy's death where there would be a reason to provoke the war. But as soon as Kennedy was dead, there was this full-scale escalation of war. And the point is that now, with the murder of the president of Korea, it was easy to bring in the troops and the tanks and keep them there on the excuse that North Korea may take advantage of the death of Park. It's a beautiful script. It's time-worn, it's wonderful, and it works. That is the thing that's so amazing about the right-wing military dictatorship. It makes you almost want to join them. They're so smart and so together, and the left is so splintered. You can't get 5 people on the left to agree on any single thing. But these dogs, they have a machinery that works. You see how they build their corporations and their multinationals, because they're smart. They don't want the conflict, so they take advantage of a situation, and they do 4 things at one time. They get rid of Park because an election is about to come up. They bring in the troops and take further control of the country. They give more power to our military and take over the headlines that we're in danger of North Korea moving south when we're not. Now, as soon as the South Korean President Park Chung-hee was killed, no sooner was he killed than the Sunday Examiner paper, October the 28th, has a story, Carter may now have his best opportunity to resolve the conflict between the North and South Korea. Carter may have his best opportunity. Now, what I think they'll do is begin to pump money into North Korea and urge them to make war with them as an eastern flank against the Soviet Union. That's what they want, and this is the true chance to bring in the troops. And they're so bold that Carter, they refer to the death of Park Chung-hee this is a story of the Examiner Washington Bureau out here, that this will give Carter the opportunity he wants. Imagine General Brown, the head of our Defense Department, Brown, was just in Korea prior to this overthrow. Henry Kissinger was in Saudi Arabia at a time, I've mentioned this other tapes, at a time when they didn't want to raise the oil price and the Shah of Iran wanted to raise the oil price. Kissinger left Saudi Arabia, and a day later King Faisal was murdered. It seems just like Richard Nixon was in Dallas, Texas, the morning Kennedy was there, and when Kennedy was killed, Nixon was back in Washington. It seems that the movers are right on the spot, giving that final okay just before it happens, and that's why our defense secretary was over there. And as soon as the president of Korea was dead, the paper says Jimmy Carter may have his best opportunities. Another article after the death came out, full details of Park's death, still vague, South Korea under martial law. Now that's what they wanted because of what I read to you before. They're in debt. They owe Japan money. They want to be industrialized. The poor are beginning to revolt and getting educated. And Tass from the Soviet Union said that another puppet will replace Park in South Korea. The trouble is the different kinds of puppet, like the Punch and Judy show. This puppet is always going to wield a stick, and now they're tightly under martial law. Another article, Korea changes their story, Park was assassinated. How can they change the story? Men were standing outside the building and they were gunned down. One man was sitting, as the secretary was sitting in the building and wasn't shot. How can a gun go off and have these people, the president of Korea and 4 others, shot to death, 4 of the bodyguards wounded? How could it be anything but an intentional takeover? And our sick media, at first they tried to cover that one into a mystery, but they couldn't even do that. And finally they said they changed the story. In our minds, the story is firm from the beginning. They have to keep changing it. There's another article about Park Chung-hee, the iron architect of modern South Korea, how he built it up. He was a man of strong but narrow intellect, single-minded. He encased himself in a triple armor of a security system and lived with his secrecy and security. It's interesting that Somoza and the Shah and Richard Nixon and some of these top dogs are still moved by the military because they're puppets all along. And the secrecy that they think they have, or the guards they think they have, are waiting to do them in at the right time. They're not the Mr. Lawton of Secret Service. The whole Secret Service was ready to do in John Kennedy when the time came, and even the new House Select Committee on Assassinations talks about the neglect, briefly mentions the neglect of the Secret Service. Another article, South Korean CIA chief was not arrested for 3 hours. We still don't know where he is. He was walking around the halls. He had his weapon. He was with the defense ministry. He was at the buildings talking with them and evidently socializing, and was not kept confined in any way. They didn't consider him a danger. And ever since our Defense Secretary Brown was there, I'm sure that these top people were prepared to set this up and end all unrest so that Japan's business investments in Korea wouldn't be overthrown by people asking for higher wages. The factories wouldn't be stopped. The investments are there. Korea owes Japan this money. Our troops are there, and we want a war in the Far East again. So we don't want anyone shaking the possibility that they become a democracy and not be anti-Soviet. It's necessary to get the military into position to fight the Soviet Union by 1985. The slain Korean President Secretary arrested and grilled One man was at this great dinner party, and the chief secretary of President Park Chung-hee, he escaped from being shot. So they're asking him how come he was in the room and wasn't shot. It wouldn't take long to figure out what this observer knew, and he is being spared, but he's being questioned. And then, of course, the Army steps up. The U.S. redeploys its forces in South Korea. Defense Secretary Harold Brown said Sunday the United States ordered a modest redeployment of the military. Remember, our military was going to be out of South Vietnam, and after his murder, we have to bring them in. Our warplanes are there. The South Korean, Japanese, U.S. military forces in Korea were put on a higher level of alert. They have their aircraft alert system going, and the troops are moving back in. What we were going to take out, we're putting back in. President Carter had asked this year for the withdrawal of the Army 2nd Division from Korea. They asked him to hold off until 1981, and he had wanted to remove these troops out of South Korea. Now they'll be in there forever. After Park was assassinated, the United States troops will never be out of South Korea, and Carter's request was just a bunch of baloney. See, Carter is a supreme puppet, also like Richard Nixon. He will say, I'm going to withdraw my ambassador from Argentina, but the Argentine people get more money, as I said last week, on business and contracts of billions of dollars. The troops are escalating into South Korea. Another article, U.S. naval force patrolling Korea. See, we have to pay the taxes, as I say, for all of the shenanigans. The South Korean is filled with American soldiers. The U.S. naval force is cruising outside. The excuse is to deter North Korea from taking advantage of the assassination. That's what the Reuters says. The excuse is to keep our 81,000-ton carrier Kitty Hawk and the entire gang in the East China Sea off South Korea. That's what we really want. The United States has 38,500 troops stationed on an alert. They've been there for 18 years, and now we've stepped up the troops, and the military force and the Pentagon can be firmly entrenched. Another article, U.S. orders carrier spy planes to Korea, and they're going on with all kinds, the boats, the planes, the foot soldiers, and so forth. I think I've pretty well covered the assassination that took place in South Korea this last week. There's an obvious imbalance of economic advantages ever since this government was taken over after the war in 1945 when Japan was out. The multinationals have put a handful of puppets in. We keep people at the same slave wage. If Japan had taken Korea, they would have probably been better off. The people would have had a better wage than they have now. Henry Miller once wrote, what if the French took all of the southern part of the United States, like New Orleans and the various states that weren't states at the time when they were here? He said that's the only place in the country where you can get good food and pretty architecture and grill work and culture. What if we had divided up, let the English and the French and various countries have part of this country? We wouldn't be worse off than what we have now, certainly. And if the Japanese had stayed in South Korea after the war, it wouldn't have mattered, because what we have in there is the same dictatorship run by Japan and the United States military, and all we offer is the military. We're not getting the advantage of the business. We keep the armies going, and Japan makes the business and the debts. So economically, they control the country, and we make the weapons and the guns and put in the CIA and train them to make the place safe for the multinationals to make their profits. The thing that keeps fascinating me about the Evita Peron story is that our heads of governments are all just these showpieces that are put in and rearranged by maybe 20 families in each country and the military dictatorship, and the rest is all show, and the people, no matter how many, can't seem to make these changes they need. The time is out. It's Mae Brussell. I'll be with you next week from Carmel, California. You take care and have a good week.